Hello everybody and welcome to your video notes on graphing. You have to forgive my voice, I'm suffering with a little bit of a head cold right now, so be impressed by my wonderful talk show radio voice that you will be enjoying over the next however long this video ends up taking. So I will be using this example that you see in front of you about ice cream sales versus temperature to cover all of the levels that you can see right here of Learning Target 4.1, which is on graphing. This video, however, we're just going to focus on the basic level, which is just making the graph. There's more words to it than that, but more or less it's just making the graph. So here's what we got. I've got my axes, I've got my y-axis and my x-axis. Y is vertical, x is horizontal. And the first thing that we have to do is decide the temperature, is that going to go on the x-axis or the y-axis? And we don't know what this experiment was because we didn't do it. So the general rule of thumb is that the first column is going to be your independent variable, and your next column will be the dependent variable. Or, if you remember, independent is on the x-axis, and the dependent variable goes on the y-axis. So once we have this figured out, we can put our units and our names onto our axes. So the temperature is going to go on the x-axis. And then you have to put the units that we're measuring in, so that way your audience knows what you're measuring in. And so we put degrees Celsius in parentheses. You need to make sure that you do this. On the y-axis, we have our dependent variable, which is ice cream sales. And those units are, it doesn't say in our data table, but we can see down below, that's measured in US dollars. That's a beautiful dollar sign, thank you. Now that we have that done, so this is part of your requirements for drawing a graph, now we have to scale our axes. Now this is where most students struggle, so I'm going to give you some pointers to help you figure out how to scale your axes properly. The way that you're going to figure out how to draw your intervals is using this equation. You're going to do the maximum value divided by the number of boxes, and this will tell you what your box value is. If you end up with a box value of 5, each box would be worth 5 whatever. So in this case, 5 degrees Celsius. So we would go 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, blah, 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 until we'd fill up our axes. Now, sometimes what you need to do, because almost every single time that you do this, you will end up with some weird decimal. So if you get a weird decimal, like say 4.8, you need to round up. Because if you end up rounding down, rounding rules tells us to round this to 5, but let's say we got 4.2. Rounding rules will tell us to round down to 4, but you would end up running out of space on your axis to get to your max value. So in this case, you would break your rounding rules and round up to 5. Okay? So here's an example of that. So on our x-axis, we have our temperature, which is in degrees Celsius, and we look for our values here. We don't just put 14.2 and then 16 and 11 and 15 and then 18, 20, like that's not what this is for. You're looking at your data right now, and I see that our maximum value is at 22.1. Oh, no, I think it's 25.1. Okay, that's going to be our max value. And then I counted the number of boxes ahead of time, so we didn't have to listen to me count. And the amount of boxes that ended up being on the x-axis for temperature is 52 boxes. So what that would look like now is I would take my maximum value, which is, give me a second here while I scroll down, our maximum value, which is our 25.1, divide that by our number of boxes, which is 52. And you just have to count that. I did that for us. And the number that we end up getting is a long string of decimals, but more or less it's 0.48. Okay? So in this situation, it's not a nice number that I want to count up in intervals of 0.48 and then figure out the next one. So we have to round this to a nicer number, which would be 0.5 is how I'm going to space out my intervals on my x-axis. So each box is going to be worth 0.5. So my first box, I could write 0.5, then 1, then 1.5 and 2, or I could instead write 1, skip 1, 2, skip 1, 3, and then I'll fill in the rest. I won't bore you with those details. I'm going to fill in the rest now. And there you have it. I went from 1 all the way up to 25, and sure, I ended up at 26, but it's better to have too many numbers here than not enough. You never want your data to only take up like this much of your graph. If your line went like that, that wouldn't be taking up enough space. You want to have it so that your data will be spaced over the whole entire space that you have in front of you. Now we're going to do the same thing with our ice cream sales. If you look over here, we're going to look for our maximum value in ice cream sales. So it looks like 400, 500, 614, that must be it. Yep. So that's our biggest one. They just so happen to be it for the same data set. That's not always the case. So now I do the same thing like before. I take my maximum value, divide it by my number of boxes, and that should be our answer. So I'm going to do 614 divided by, I counted this, I can't remember. Oh, it was 24 boxes. So I'm going to do 614 divided by 24 boxes, and that gives me 24.56. Now that's an ugly number. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to round up to a nice whole number, which in this case, or not necessarily a whole number, but just a nice number for my intervals. 25 is an easy one. I can do that all day. 25, 50, 75, 100, 125, and so on. So then I'm going to come over to my ice cream sales. My first box would be 25. My next one would be 50. The one after that would be 75. And then this one would be 100. So I'm just going to mark that. Okay, you don't have to write down for every box, but I know that this would be 25, 50, 75, 100. And I'm going to take a break and I'll do that for you. And there we have it. Sorry for the messy handwriting. I didn't give myself very much space. So there's my intervals. So again, this is probably one of the most tricky parts for people to understand. Now I have to plot my data points and add a trend line. And then at some point I have to put a title on my graph as well. I'm going to go ahead and plot the data points because I think everybody's pretty good at that. So I don't want to waste our time with that in our video. Be back in a moment. All right, here are my data points. It took me a little while because it's a little tricky to do on a screen. In fact, I even taught class in between doing this. Shout out to 6th Hour. So now I have my points plotted, and now I have to add in my trend line. You'll notice that my data isn't perfectly in a line, and that is going to be true of almost every piece of data that we take in class because it's experimental. So the way that we do this is we want our line to fit the general trend of what we see here, kind of going up and to the right at the same rate as these lines are. Since it's not in a perfect line, we'll have to make it work for the most we can. So I'm going to try drawing my, I want to do a straight line. And maybe something like that will work. Yes, I think that this will be perfect. We've got this going in the general direction of the line, and this is going to come up in our next segment, but we want to make sure that it hits at least 2 points, and it looks like I had it hit 3 points. And the reason that you want to do that is because the next thing you're going to do is calculate the slope. And we will do that in our next video. I'm back. There's one thing we forgot to do, and that was give us a title on our graph. If you don't have your title, you won't get full points for the basic level. So you can come up with a creative or not very creative title. This one we could maybe say ice cream sales versus temperature. So I'm just gonna, yeah. Ice cream and temperature data. Something like that. Nothing too fancy, but just something so that way we can identify what our graph is about. That's all for now. Next video is on slope.